What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode is portfolio manager and chief strategist at Simplify Asset Management, Mike Green. Mike and I have known each other for many years now, and in all of that time, I don't think I've ever had a conversation with Mike that didn't move the needle for me in one way or another. This is a special skill that Mike has. He's a deep thinker, and so much of what he has to say is value additive. It illuminates some aspect of the market or some social or political phenomenon or dynamic that has profound explanatory power. And this conversation was no exception to that. We spent the first hour discussing a number of topics that I've explored on this podcast before, related to corporate versus state power, the role of government in the economy, the lack of leadership in government, and what kinds of reforms are needed in order to resolve some of the structural challenges that our political economy faces. The second hour, which is available to premium subscribers only, drills into our conversation around corporate power in much more depth, as well as the role and responsibility of media personalities and organizations in serving the public interest. We also discuss inflation, its drivers, as well as how to maintain optionality, something that is very important to me from both a financial and non-financial perspective, while at the same time protecting oneself from sovereign credit risk. Again, something that deeply concerns me and which I know is top of mind for those of you concerned about the long-term status of the US dollar and all fiat currencies, especially if you believe that we have transitioned into a new inflationary regime with structurally higher consumer prices and costs of capital. For anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. I don't rely on advertisers or commercial sponsors. So if you want access to the second hour of today's conversation, as well as the transcripts and intelligence reports, which include my takeaways from every episode, as well as my thoughts on what comes next, head over to hiddenforces.io, select the episode that you're interested in, and click on the premium extras, where you can then sign up to one of our premium content tiers. And with that, please enjoy this intellectually expansive and deeply satisfying conversation with my friend, Mike Green. Mike Green, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Welcome back. Thank you very much, Demetri. It's always a thrill to come back and speak with you and your audience.
Yeah, I should have said welcome back. The last time we spoke, I think, was during the early part of the pandemic, right? I feel like it was March of 2020 or something like that.
It's been a while since we've done an episode. We did one prior to the pandemic talking about dynamics of passive investing and some of the thoughts around the world. And then as the pandemic kicked in, I believe we did one in March 2020, where I shared some of what I was seeing. If you remember at that point in time, basically the question is like, is the world coming to an end? Are markets going to zero, et cetera? And one of the critical things that I think I was fortunate in recognizing was that the quantity of stimulus that was coming into the market, the support that was coming in, meant that we were highly likely to see a move to new all-time highs fairly quickly. And that, of course, has played out. And now the world feels like a very different place, right? And in 2 years' time, it feels like a lifetime ago, basically, since we've spoken.
Yeah, that first episode, I think, was episode 114, and it was a really popular one at the time on the rise of passive. I strongly recommend people go back to listen to that episode. The second episode we did, I don't think has an episode number. I think it was back when I was still doing kind of special one-off pieces. But that's back when you were reading Mike Duncan's book on the fall of the Roman Republic.
Yeah, The Storm Before the Storm.
Right, the beginning of the end.
Which is still a book I strongly recommend to people, yes.
Yeah, so again, people should go check that out as well. It's always really useful to go back and listen to a lot of those episodes that came out in the early stages of the pandemic. Just like I think it was useful to speak with Russell Napier, again, someone we had on twice, but the first time I had Russell on, we talked about his experience living through the Asian financial crisis because he had recently published a book, which was essentially diary entries from his time in Hong Kong between 1995 and 1998, I believe. So it's always useful to do that. So Mike, as you know, I'm always excited to have you on because you're kind of this big, soggy brain that pulsates and is very interesting to speak to about kind of everything. You have one of those wide-ranging curiosities. So rather than kind of create too much structure to this episode, I thought it would make more sense for us just to kind of explore the contours of your brain folds instead of actually like doing that.
My big soggy brain, yeah.
Your brain in a vat. Not actually very far from where some of the conversation may go, actually.
Were this actually video, your audience could see how large my forehead is. So it's...
Exactly. So what's been on your mind these days?
Well, we talked a little bit about this, but so my world is kind of split into what I would describe as 3, maybe 4 focus streams. The first is my day job as chief strategist and portfolio manager for Simplify Asset Management requires me to be active in the markets and to be monitoring the incoming data, both from a macroeconomic sense and from a trading sense, right? And so, I've got my Bloomberg streaming in the background as we're chatting, and in very classic, financial market participant form, I'm distracted always by kind of what's going on in the world of finance. That has changed markedly, as I pointed out, from the period of the pandemic. We've gone from an environment in which we were in a market that had sold off very, very sharply and we're facing incredible amounts of stimulus, to today we're sitting and looking at a world in which almost the exact opposite is true, right? Except for the fact that the markets have again sold off. This time, regulators, policymakers, et cetera, are borderline overtly hostile to the asset space, right? And are doing everything they can to try to slow the economy in the hopes of reducing the inflationary pressures that we face. And so I'd suggest that if we were to talk about that, there might be a very different message today than otherwise. Part of that process leads to the second component, which is trying to understand this new and what I very firmly believe is a temporary world of scarcity in contrast to the world of abundance. And it feels very ironic to me that we've spent an awful lot of time over the last several years talking about things like non-fungible tokens, et cetera, that are designed to create scarcity in the digital world. And yet suddenly we're confronted with the atomic reality of scarcity in the physical world, whether that ranges from energy to food to fertilizer to, candidly, babies, right? We have a shortage developing across all of these metrics. And then the last component is just kind of the societal exploration. And there, I've really enjoyed episodes like you discussed, Russell Napier, et cetera. I continue to believe that we're at a period of transition in which the society that we inhabit is simultaneously trying to make progress against a new world in which we behave very differently, and a Make America Great Again or a restore the old world type view that unfortunately I think is hopeless in its reality, right? We can't go back in time, at least not successfully. But we are facing this very real societal transition. And as both an investor and as a parent, I'm very, very focused on these dynamics and what it means for me, my family, and the society that I participate in.
I wonder, this literally just popped into my head, but I was thinking about nostalgia because the phenomenon of nostalgia has always interested me because I have a tendency to nostalgize quite a bit.
We all do, for very obvious reasons.
Yes,
right?
Though some more than others. And I think I veer on doing it more than maybe is useful. In fact, there are some that would argue it's totally pointless to do it. And I had thought about doing an episode, and I had actually looked into doing an episode to see if I could actually structure it and who would I bring on to talk about this phenomenon. But I wonder if also that it's more common today because we have baby boomers who are, the vast majority of baby boomers are still alive, and many of them are doing quite well physically and mentally, but the world has changed so dramatically from what existed when they were younger. And I wonder if you have periods of heightened social nostalgia simply that correlates with changing demographics,
Well, that would absolutely be the principles behind something like the fourth turning concept, right? Neil Howe. And again, I think that many of those things are very interesting. I think that the challenge is that we're all familiar with the expression that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. We're drawn to seek out patterns, right? As human beings, as mammals, candidly, seeking out patterns is a way of shortcutting an analysis of the world. right? If it was a random event, did the sun come up each day, right? Our lives would be extraordinarily difficult. And so we seek those sort of rhythms and patterns. And when we encounter disruption, that actually creates stress, right? I mean, that's what the cortisol hormone is all about, is it's designed to engender a response and a desire not to enjoy that process. Although weirdly, as a society, I think that we're so inured to the day-to-day existence. And this is something we talked about in the prelude to the episode that I'm sure we'll address. We use the language of waking up constantly now, right? And what we're really saying is, we're sleepwalking through our existence. Somebody please provide me with enough shot of adrenaline to give me something to feel alive, right? And anyone who's actually really lived elements of their lives, right? The birth of your child, the death of a loved one, et cetera, understands that those exist, right? And you need to embrace them. But I think that's actually one of the weird things that's happened, particularly to the younger generation, where many of those activities have been suspended, right? Their parents have lived far longer than parents that preceded them. So most of them have not had the experience of death. That's part of the reason why I would argue that the COVID experience was so alien and frightening to many people, right? It also simultaneously engaged the thrill-seeking component, right? Oh my gosh, it's so dangerous. I'm going to the grocery store. So I think there's this weird component here.
That younger people, you're saying specifically, experienced that sense of thrill, not that older people did.
Well, older people, I think, genuinely experienced some fear around it, right? And you could see that, and there was genuine risk associated with it. Those who are prone to anxiety, I think, and that unfortunately describes a disproportionately high fraction of our society today, found themselves under genuine distress and seeking ways to avoid that fear, right? But those amongst us who by and large live a what I would describe as somewhat normal existence, like going to the grocery store, suddenly took on, elements of, okay, am I properly prepared? Do I have my mask? Do I have my gun? Do I have my flashlight? Am I properly prepared with my contactless payment systems so that I can venture out into the wild and confront the saber-toothed tiger? I mean, the cashier, right? There was an element of excitement and thrill that we were all participating in this great adventure. And now, we're seeking other ways of feeling alive again.
I think this is really interesting. Someone I've quoted many times on this show over the years is Joseph Campbell, whose work, it was some of the most influential of any author or scholar that I've ever read. And I think it's especially relevant for younger people. It's really timeless in that sense. It's timelessly relevant, but particularly today. And one of the things that Joseph Campbell talked about was that, and I think this was from an interview that he did with Bill Moyers when he was nearing his death. We didn't know it during the interview, but I believe he had cancer during those interviews. And he said that it isn't so much that people are looking for the meaning of life. They're looking for the feeling of being alive.
Living. Yeah. It's really powerful. I mean, I just want to emphasize that, right? That, and again, you and I had a joke. My microphone is propped up on the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? What is the meaning of life, the universe, and everything? 42, right? It's such a deeply unsatisfying answer, and it just tells you you've improperly framed the question. What we're really looking for is that feeling that we all imagine exists around being alive.
Yeah.
This magical consciousness.
Totally. I want to see if I want to try and bring this to a point that maybe has some kind of practical significance. But before I do that, maybe I'll venture out again into the eternal chaos of spitballing. But you and I were talking about the episode that I recently released, which I had published originally and written in 2017, back then titled Industrial Society and Its Future. This time the title had something to do with machine intelligence, humanity, and the will to power. But that reference of the will to power, which is actually a reference to Nietzsche, is a distortion of what I was referencing in the episode, which was the power process, which is the term that Ted Kaczynski, otherwise known as the Unabomber, wrote in his paper Industrial Society and Its Future from the mid-1990s. And it's captured also in a sense in Thoreau's Going to the Woods, and also in the Marxian critique that industrialization alienates the worker from the fruits of his or her own labor. And I feel like that trend has only grown in the last 25 years since Kaczynski wrote that paper. or really more than 25 years. And in some sense, it's been growing over the course of the last two industrial revolutions, really the last 200 years of human progress. And now we're at this place where a lot of the conversations that are happening about how to organize human society are framed along the lines of how much do we want to subsidize the mass of humanity versus how much do we want to construct policies that operate under a kind of Malthusian limits to growth framework that suggests that we have to kind of call the populations. So where is it? But this idea that human beings should have more or the same amount of agency over their lives and be able to exercise power in the way that we would be accustomed to isn't really part of the framing. Nor, I think, is, and this is kind of where I'm going to, like you get guys like Andrew Yang, for example, who's been on the podcast, and Andrew Yang's a big supporter of universal basic income, and you get a lot of these tech folks whose business models incidentally run on being able to extract income from people who could be very much mindless in their consumption of ads and being, moved around and shepherded in space, who support this idea of universal basic income, but that doesn't actually speak to the power process. It doesn't actually speak to people's need to feel alive, to be able to push into a world and experience the sense that their push is generating some kind of reaction. And so I think that it's a theory, it's not just mine, but I think this is part of why we have a lot of the issues that we have in society today. Rates of depression, suicide, self-harm. I'm curious, this is not immediately apparent how this has economic ramifications, though it does, but I'm just curious, how would you react to that? Like, what are your thoughts about that general framing?
Well, so I think it's very hard, right? Because I think individuals like Andrew Yang and their support for universal basic income, there's definitely reasons to understand that thought process and to recognize that they're correctly identifying a true challenge that exists for many individuals, right? Which is finding a way to contribute productively to society in a manner that is, monetarily remunerative enough that they're able to live their best life, right? I guess the problem that I have with it is at the end, at its core, while it feels very respectful and you're trying to say, okay, I want to enable you to live your dreams, it's really quite disrespectful in saying you're not capable of accomplishing it on your own, right? And so it is a solution. It's effectively the equivalent of putting a Band-Aid on a problem rather than actually diagnosing the source of the issue itself and figuring out a way for those individuals to contribute, constructing society in a manner that we all feel that we have agency and contribution. I was just going through, I actually posted, and my Twitter feed, it's funny. For those who don't follow me on Twitter, it's at ProfPlum99. Weird, I don't look anything like my avatar or anything else. So, not that you'll see my image on the podcast component. But I sometimes come across not as a fund manager, I come across as a social critic in a way that says, the elites are doing things that are not helpful for us, right? And I genuinely believe that that's true, but I think that it's being sourced from this disrespect, this general belief that people are not capable of this. And there's a long history of this dating back to the founders and Madison's observation that we can have an excess of democracy, right? Mm-hmm. Too many people uninformed, making poor choices. The solution to that is not to rob people of their choices, although a system of checks and balances, for example, the appointment of senators as compared to the direct election that we changed in the 19th century, was an important check against that, right? But the reason why we moved away from that also reveals another failing of society, which is that elites often can't agree, right? And they get themselves locked up in conflicts that are remarkably petty in their own dynamics. And I think, unfortunately, right now we're suffering from both. So we have, by and large, chose to disinvest from our population. This is true, particularly in the United States, but also I would argue broadly true in places like the developed world, where the younger generation is increasingly less educated, particularly on issues of governance and social dynamics, relative to this desire for, can you learn how to code, for example, right? Those play important roles, but if we're going to have a thoughtful and intelligent electorate, we have to make the investments. We've failed to do that. We've increasingly outsourced it to the internet, Reddit, various conspiracy mills, et cetera. And then you have the elites who basically say, yeah, well, we just need to figure out bread and circuses and ways to distract these people so that they're ultimately not interfering in the progress that we see so clearly. The way I would just describe it is we need to figure out a broader way to respect each other and understand where other individuals' perspective both brings value, not just because they are of a different race or of a different genetic, chromosomal makeup, meaning they're male or female or whatever, right? But also because their actual lived experience, growing up in a trailer park or growing up on Park Avenue, brings a richness to the dialogue that we just need to figure out some better way of accommodating, right? And it's not shouting over Twitter, right? That's not the answer.
Yeah, a few thoughts there. I mean, the last one, just in reference to the public forum in which conversations are going on. I think if we could solve anything, I can't readily think of anything that would be more impactful than properly regulating the space of public discussion. That's something we can come back to. But I had some thoughts when you were talking, which is that in a country like China, constitutionally speaking, or legally speaking, the way their system is organized, the Chinese people are seen much more along the lines of a population to be managed. And I think that, to your point about how we've expanded the franchise in the United States and how we've also democratized other parts of the legislature and the legislative system, I think, though actually this is not something I've thought about before, so I don't know what the scholarship says about it, but my guess would be that this reflects the broadening of the base of education in the United States. The fact that we had more of the electorate was educated, and so with that, they demanded more democratization and to have more power over the levers of government. I wonder if what we're seeing now is an environment that actually is more conducive to less democracy, not just because elites are asking for it because it's convenient, because there's a greater disparity of wealth and income, but in fact, because more and more people are actually less able to take on the responsibilities of citizenship. They're less interested in that kind of stuff. And the other thing that I think is also interesting, I just want to kind of throw this in there and then give you the floor to respond. What's really weird, and I get folks like Josh, for example, I know Josh has talked about this, which is that he was for a long time against the idea that that we didn't have free will. I think he supported the idea of free will. And the more and more he thinks about it philosophically, that maybe in fact, free will is an illusion. I'm just also interested in how ideas about who we are have radically changed. And you end up having conversations about transhumanism, or in this case about free will, that, okay, it's free will is an illusion. We're all we think we have free will, we think we have agency, but everything is actually just capricious and the outcome of certain deterministic functions that derive from some predisposition to behave a particular way or whatever it might be, which I think conforms very conveniently with these ideas of universal basic income and, relative power structures as the drivers of society, that individuals don't actually have free will, which I think also speaks of something else you talk about, which is that the frontier has dissipated. So there's less opportunities for the individual to strike out into society. How would you respond to all of that?
Well, all of that is a lot to respond to, right? But I think the thing I would seize on is this idea that we can't expect people, or fewer people want to be involved in governance. Fewer people are capable of these types of things. I think that's actually a failure of expectations, right? It's an underlying belief structure that our educational system largely consists of babysitting services that are designed to prevent young men, and to a lesser extent young women, from behaving in inappropriate fashion while their parents are working. That we generally have this idea that we're all just going through the motions, right?
Same thing with college, man. This goes back to when I graduated too. I remember being online to graduate from college, and the person next to me, who I knew kind of vaguely, told me that he felt like he didn't really learn anything in 4 years. I feel like that's a common experience for a lot of people. They go to college and they see it as their kind of right to basically piss off 4 years of their lives, party, have fun, and live somewhere outside of their house, but don't actually take it as this privilege and this opportunity to really learn that you're never going to get back,
And I do think that there was a societal component to that, right? I mean, when we talk about the student debt crisis, it's easy to forget that over half of the outstanding student debt was not to finance tuition, but instead to finance lifestyle, right? So paying for room and board, paying for living expenses, paying for books, et cetera. All of those components play into this type of dynamic. And there's a running joke, that was shared with me from parents among those whose kids go to the SEC conference where, the state schools effectively with unlimited resources that have been expanded dramatically. And they say, gosh, I hope my kid really learns something so that they can maintain their lifestyle once they leave college. You're enough younger than I am that you don't remember when MTV Spring Break started. But, I went to an elite school with very affluent individuals. I personally was not affluent, and I harbor incredible resentment to my parents against that. But that's a joke, by the way, but the simple reality is that the spring break experience that proliferated through the 90s and into the 2000s and now feels that it's being reduced, at least to a certain extent, but still highly normalized, just didn't even exist, right? I mean, the vast majority of students couldn't imagine going off to Cabo or to Jamaica and experiencing, or Daytona and experiencing the sort of nonsense that we've seen for years and years and years, where kids, were battling with cops over their right to consume alcohol in the public streets, right? I mean, that's an absurd period in history that I think echoes, you and I have shared a growing appreciation for the Renaissance in Bill Maher, right? This dynamic of being an unserious people. With 3 kids in college today, I would suggest that seems to be dissipating to a certain extent. And I do think that that's one of the things that I look at, and it may just be my personal experience and, my overappreciation for my own children. But I do think that we're moving to a slightly more serious frame. Something broke in the global financial crisis, and I would suggest really broke with coronavirus, that has caused kids to increasingly focus on what am I actually trying to accomplish here. We see that in a rise in STEM degrees. We've seen a collapse in people seeking liberal arts degrees. The proportion of people getting English majors has fallen dramatically. The proportion of people beginning to get computer science majors is beginning to rise dramatically. So we're becoming a more serious people. And that's one of the things that I would suggest is hopeful on the flip side of that. The extreme version of that for me is, one of my kids is at the U.S. Naval Academy, and I talked to him about what his day is like. And it's like, oh my God, dude, you do understand how non-typical your experience is, right? I am hopeful that there's a change underway that means that some of the statements that you're making are episodic, similar to how we would have dismissed the hippies and then ultimately they gave us Apple Computer and everything else that came out of it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, these things are always cyclical, but obviously we don't know how long that cycle lasts or what part we're in, but it does certainly feel like if it were going to get more absurd than this, it would really be comical, and it already is comical. Well, let's talk about leadership. This is something that's like on my mind a lot. And I think it's on a lot of people's minds, even if they don't articulate it or aware enough of it on a conscious level, which is that we have the worst leadership options of any point in my lifetime. I mean, I was alive. I don't really remember Ronald Reagan. So there was Ronald Reagan in my lifetime. We had George H.W. Bush. We had Bill Clinton. We had George W. Bush. We had Obama. Then we had Trump. We had, Jimmy Carter, who caught a lot of flack and got a lot of shit for being weak in the late 70s. Nixon, of course, Ford, he fell a couple of times, but there was no one whose mental faculties were so derisively questioned like with Biden, or whose dedication to the duties of the office have been as capricious as with Trump. And I struggle to understand why we haven't been able to do any better. And I'm curious to know what you think is going on. Why can't we seem to elect better candidates to public office these days? And why doesn't there seem to be anyone qualified on the horizon?
Well, part of it, I think, unfortunately, is a function of how our society is currently structured, which is instead of a positive advancement component, like we have this great lie of meritocracy, right? Instead of a positive advancement component, it is a negative advancement component, right? You can be canceled. It's very hard to be promoted. there are very few events from a societal standpoint that are equivalent to a World War II currently. Like everyone that you just described almost played a role in World War II, right? Jimmy Carter was at Annapolis and a member of the U.S. Naval Academy, right? And served with honor. Ronald Reagan played a patriotic role, was governor of California, moved forward over time, right?
H.W. Bush was shot over the Pacific.
It was actually the very first,
or not shot over.
Pilot.
I think maybe he ran out of gas or something. I don't remember what it was that happened.
Yeah, I believe that his plane was shot and his fuel tanks drained and he had to ditch into the ocean, right? But he was one of the very first aviators to be shot in the World War II conflict, right? John F. Kennedy with PT-103 or 109, I'm sorry. Bob Dole, World War II hero, right, et cetera. Mm-hmm. We had a series of individuals who had the opportunity for greatness thrust upon them in a way that was not the grooming. Obviously, JFK is an exception to this, but there was not the grooming dynamic that you see with Gavin Newsom or Nancy Pelosi's family or the children of celebrities, et cetera. There was an element of a voyage of discovery, new individuals entering it, et cetera. We've been through periods like this before, right? The era of great expectations, that came to an end with the election of Andrew Jackson, right? Effectively, we moved from the founders and the pseudo-royalty of the United States to, the 1824 election was stolen from Jackson in exactly the manner that people tend to describe with Trump because the elites thought he was unacceptable. Right. So we've been through this process before. You go through a period in which there's conflict and people rise to the top and there's true competition for the elites in society and ways in which people draw attention to themselves. And then it's replaced by stasis. Right.
But, the government had less power over your life in 1824. And not just over your life, but over the world, because the government is not just more powerful within these federated states, but also the United States is the global empire. Or rather, let me say it had for a period of time been the modern equivalent of a global empire. You could call it a hegemon overseeing a multinational corporate governance, system with certain global governing institutions. And that power has been waning, and it is being challenged by the likes primarily really of China. I mean, China is the real challenger to U.S. hegemony. If China wasn't a global player, the United States would still pretty much have free reign in the world that we live in today.
So I think there's some truth to that. I do want to push back a little bit, right? So I mean, yes, the role of the government in terms of our economy is larger today than it was in 1824 or 1828, right? On the flip side of that, what we describe as GDP, which is really income on a national level, had a radically different form back then, right? So it's hard for people to even imagine. But in the Panic of 1838, for example, the statistics suggest that the unemployment rates in the United States approached 60%, 60, right? In a period in which the government ostensibly had far less influence in our lives, the Civil War, which was a government action, 600,000 Americans, far more that have been lost in any other conflict to their deaths, it was somewhere around 2+% of the U.S. population in a time period in which we were running a relative shortage of labor, right? So the idea that government has not played a significant role, I think, in part reflects a simplification of what the government actually represented. If you go back and you look at that time period, things like the Homestead Act, et cetera, where you had the distribution of land from the U.S. government, that had an extraordinary impact. It just reflects that the role of the government was different. The government owned the land and sold it off, provided title in exchange for revenues versus taxing people's income. Right? We had a different resource. We then moved to property taxes as the primary sources of funding the government. We then moved to income taxes, et cetera, right? So we've just had changes in the form that it takes. And our ability to police, monitor, maintain our society, et cetera, it's hard for people to imagine, but the history of police forces in the United States is really very much a 19th century invention, right? We didn't really have police in the same form. We had a local sheriff.
And private corporations as well.
And private corporations, right? The Pinkerton Agency, et cetera. So, I would just suggest that many of the things that you talked about, this dynamic of nostalgia, right? And the propensity to be nostalgic for a past, we often forget that past didn't really exist, right? It's colored by the haze of fond memories and the success that we had by definition because we're here to observe it. If we lived on Easter Island, for example, we couldn't be nostalgic for an era because nobody survived it.
Yeah, Easter Island. I feel like, sometimes I feel like that's a really good analogy for a lot of the broken sort of capital allocation models of today. So 2 things I want to draw out and ask you them separately, and you can decide how you want to respond to them. One is what I picked up on, which is scarcity. Or the opposite side of that, which is abundance, having so much land that you can just sell it off, the rights to land, sell it off, and in so doing, appease and also raise the funds that you need. And are we now living in a world of increased scarcity? Part of that our own doing, right? We could talk about that. And then this other thing that I think someone who I know you've studied or you read his book, not Leviathan. What was the name of Matt Stoller's book?
Goliath,
Leviathan.
Yeah,
no, it's
Leviathan's another book that people should read. But
slight confusion there, though both very large biological masses of power. Let's talk about what I was moving towards was corporate versus state power. And people seem to be obsessed with state power today. And I think that while they should be concerned about state power, and there are things that they should be concerned about, they're wrongly obsessing over it and not properly spending enough time considering the centralization of corporate power.
Oh, 100% agree.
Okay, so take those however you want to, either the scarcity versus abundance or corporate power versus state power.
So just very quickly on Twitter, I shared an image yesterday. Today is August 30th, by the way, that showed 2, I'm going to use the term Russian babushkas, right? But the traditional ethnic attire sort of component where they're selling eggs and they're in competition with each other at a card table, right? You may have seen this video, yeah. Right? Okay. So my joke was the one on the right worked for KKR.
Tell people who, because not everyone will have seen this video, give them the really short, the TLDR version.
So the TLDR version of this is it's 2 women both selling eggs. They can't see each other's price sign. The one on the left is priced at 140, let's say rubles. And the one on the right is priced at, 125 or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. I forget exactly what the numbers are. And somebody comes and buys from the woman who's priced cheaper, right? Because they're selling a commodity. One is priced cheaper. The other woman looks at it and says, oh my gosh, she pulls out a sign, lowers her price to $100 or 100 rubles and sits there smugly. And then the person on the right pulls out a 100 ruble note, pays for the eggs, now has a monopoly, and then raises the price of eggs to $3.40, right? And my joke was 2 components, right? The one on the right works for KKR, and then hashtag inflation, right? That's actually not inflation. That's market power. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the things that I find so frustrating, and that Matt Stoller, I think, has done a remarkably good job of highlighting. In periods of inflation, theoretically, cost pressures are causing corporations to be forced to raise prices, right? That should be leading to a deterioration of corporate margins. Instead, we're seeing the opposite. We have the highest levels of corporate profitability in history. Corporate profit margins just hit a new record, right? So what we're actually seeing, I would argue, is largely a function of snafus in supply chains that are leading to the ability to push through price increases in the absence of significant competition. Right? Now, that feels very at odds, but you see this in your own experience, right? Do you use Amazon as aggressively for price comparison as you used to? No, because Amazon is in many situations no longer at a significant price discount to where you can source elsewhere online. What you're paying for is the convenience associated with Amazon Prime, with the underlying dynamic that this is the store in which you can accumulate and buy everything, right? You're going right back to the dynamics that led rise to the department store, the general store, giving way to the department store in major cities where you could buy any number of items, very conveniently and at prices that reflected the economies of scale associated with that, right? Matt Stoller is all over this, right? The level of concentration and loss of competition that has occurred in the US economy through consolidation, in particular horizontal consolidation, much less so than vertical consolidation, which is part of the reason we have the supply chain challenges that we have, has been extraordinary, right? And, I've been in industry now for roughly 30 years. When I entered the industry, I went into management consulting. One of the key components of our work was advising corporations that were engaged in the process of acquisitions, right? Mergers and acquisitions. And one of the critical things that we had to consider was what's called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, which is a degree of concentration. The degree of concentration across industries today dwarfs anything that we would have even imagined the FTC would have allowed back in 1990. It's unbelievable when you think about the degree of concentration that exists across many industries. That's been facilitated by the investment markets that we participate in. The choice to invest passively rewards the largest companies in most situations by virtue of discounted cost of capital. We increasingly operate under, you mentioned Reagan. I would suggest that equally influential is Robert Bork, who most of us know as being famous for not being able to make it onto the Supreme Court because of some of his writings. But what he was most powerful in is the Bork doctrine as it relates to antitrust enforcement, where we moved from the presumption of market power to the evidence of market power where price was the only criteria. Right? As a result, we turn around and we say, oh, there's nothing wrong with, Coca-Cola acquiring Pepsi-Cola as long as I believe that the consolidation of the two is not going to manifest itself in higher prices for consumers. What is my evidence that it's not going to manifest itself in higher prices for consumers? Well, the presumption of competition. Right? And so that is the world that we operated under, and we operated under it for a very long period of time. And today, we're seeing the exact opposite, where corporations in many situations have impunity to raise prices because there is a shortage of supplies and a shortage of competition, right? And an inability for competition to emerge. I mean, look at what's happening in the airline industry right now, where Spirit Air and Frontier Airlines, two low-cost discount airlines, attempted to merge, and JetBlue, a formerly discount airline, shows up and says, oh, no, hey, we want to acquire, right? We're going to further consolidate the industry. And as a result, all of us are paying a ridiculous price to fly our families to, travel for Thanksgiving. Right. So we're absolutely experiencing this.
Yeah, totally. And actually, I do want to discuss more about the implications of that and where it takes us. But something else that came to mind when we were talking about Amazon is that Amazon, of course, doesn't list, I know this as a fact because I order a lot of things on Amazon, including oftentimes the same exact thing for different guests. Sometimes I'll buy them microphones. And
you've never bought anything from me, by the way. And I've been on the show 3 times now.
I exercise a Marxian framework when it comes to the provisioning of goods and services to my guests' mics. So from each guest according to his ability, to each according to his needs.
All right.
So, but the thing I know, and I know this because I've looked into it as well, Amazon primarily because it's the biggest online retailer, but every online retailer practices this to the extent that retailer has the means by which to do it, which is to variably price goods based on the knowledge of the customer.
Mm-hmm.
And based on a variety of factors, some of which can be tailored based on how much you've interacted with that person and how large your data set is about them. But some of it's just basic information about geography, zip codes, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And that speaks to, it's a kind of a way of bridging us going from pricing to variable pricing based on knowledge about the customer to control and power that doesn't express itself in terms of pricing power, but rather simply raw power. In the case of platforms like Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not talking about in pricing power with advertisers. I'm talking about with the vast majority of people who use the platform. And I'm picking on Facebook specifically because Mark Zuckerberg was recently on Joe Rogan. And I don't know if you saw that podcast or watched it.
I saw parts of it. I wasn't able to watch the full component of it.
I kind of got bored of watching it, actually.
So did I.
Yeah, I got bored of I tried watching it. Unfortunately, it wasn't as good. And God bless Joe for, first of all, great that he had him on. But there was a really revealing moment that showed me just how ill-equipped Joe Rogan was for that conversation. And it came during the part where they were talking about, quote, algorithms. Mm-hmm. And the decision to suppress certain types of information. And Joe's response was like, well, why can't you just not use algorithms and you just have a... And then he proceeded to basically provide an algorithmically tailored solution. And I think a lot of people really fail to appreciate, and I think all of us in some ways, even just in our day-to-day, just how intermediated our experiences are. One, and two, that those are deliberately choices and decisions made by corporations, which is the greatest concentration of power in corporate history. It's greater than Standard Oil. It's greater than U.S. Steel. It's greater than American Telephone and Telegraph or the United Fruit Company or any of these giant monopolies and trust companies that we read about in school when we were learning about antitrust. Because these companies, I mean, they're merging increasingly magic-like technologies with the totality of human knowledge around science, behavioral science, psychology. And people are getting manipulated in ways that all of us, in ways that we really can't fully grasp. And more, as more and more of life happens in this digital metaverse, where guys like Zuckerberg are basically saying, we want to be the gatekeepers. We want to be the people that build the platforms, that write the code, that determine the quality and substance of that experience that you have. To me, this is the most frightening part of modernity. Because while we can talk about autonomous weapons, we can talk about nuclear weapons, we can talk about synthetic biology, we can talk about Wuhan lab releasing viruses, et cetera, none of that shit gets solved. None of that shit gets solved while at the same time maintaining our humanity and our sense of agency and to say nothing about our democracy in Western countries that have liberal democracies, without being able to safeguard the integrity of our communal experiences and our own mental and bodily integrities. And I think all of those things have been and are continuing to be challenged and are not being addressed. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I think that they are... I'm going to go pretty far afield here in my response, right? I think much of what you describe is a byproduct of a unique period of human evolution, and intentionally use the phrase evolution, right? So we developed our senses, we developed our eyes. Obviously, we didn't. Evolution shaped them to allow us to obtain the maximum quantity of stimulus from the outside world so that we were able to create a survival advantage, right? And so, if you are sitting at home and you have creationists, knock on your front door, they'll say, the human eye couldn't have functioned, unless it was perfect in its design. Oh, that's total crap, right? A shadow sensor, something that tells me whether there's a shadow or there's not a shadow, provides me with a market advantage over not having that, right? And so everything that we have evolved as a species has been a function of adding sensors in the same way we're now adding them to cars to maximize the amount of information that we have available to us. And suddenly, in the last 20 to 30 years, we've encountered an environment in which that information flow has turned into a flood. And everything that you're describing, right, is people desperately seeking ways to pare that down. Some people are being forced into that from economics, right? So I am very fortunate in having a career in which over the course of 30 years, I had access to information that most people couldn't even begin to imagine, right? And even back before that, I was privileged to attend, schools that provided me with resources and libraries and an intellectual curiosity that encouraged me to take advantage of them and read voraciously. When I entered into the industry working in management consulting, we had access to LexisNexis databases that cost money, but my clients paid for it. And so I was able to research any number of things that the vast majority of people would have no capability of doing unless they were buried within an academic setting. And I was, again, privileged to be able to do that within a competitive business world setting so that I developed a different perspective than a simple academic on these things. Today, we're in a world in which people, broadly speaking, have received this incredible flood of information with no mechanism for paring it down. And now we're beginning to withdraw that and increasingly put things behind paywalls. And many people are being forced, not by virtue of the quality, but simply by a function of how much time they have to allocate and by the cost associated with it, to limit their information resources, and are increasingly gravitating to people who provide them with validation of their views, right? We're becoming tribal in our information and fact sets, right? It's distinctly unhealthy. And at the same time, I don't know the answer to it. We've been through periods like this before, right? The advent of radio created the opportunity for entertainment and the diffusion of information that was potentially quite caustic from a societal standpoint. We saw the same thing with the proliferation and then consolidation of newspapers and the advent of yellow journalism, et cetera, right? Father Coughlin in the Great Depression building the world's largest transmitter. In many ways, our current system of limitations on broadcasting rights, et cetera, that we still have not updated really for the internet era, in which people suddenly have platforms that are far more powerful than Father Coughlin's. But for those who don't know the narrative, he built a radio station that transmitted with so much power it was capable of basically reaching everybody in the United States. Right? There were limitations placed around that. That's why we had the franchisees of, your radio station was different than my radio station. The cable systems were set up in the same way. And now we've consolidated them all. We've turned it into a national experience. So we don't have local news, we have national news. We're all fantastically focused on Joe Biden instead of our incompetent local council, right? We're much less interested in the reality around what our children are being educated in school, because candidly, the entire system is set up to focus us not on those issues, but on issues of national importance that candidly are irrelevant for the most part. There is no functional distinction between Joe Biden and Donald Trump in many ways. Nor was there really a meaningful distinction between Joe Biden and Ronald Reagan, who was also considered old and decrepit and an indication of the collapse of Western society, that a B-movie actor had risen to the most powerful position on earth. And we received any number of songs, from bands like Genesis that assumed that, Ronald Reagan was completely incompetent and was going to press the button accidentally when he woke up. If you remember the Land of Confusion video, where Ronald Reagan was presented as a Muppet.
Oh, I think I've seen one of those.
It's definitely worth watching. It's a mediocre song, but actually a great music video. But so we've always had these components out there. I would argue that our attention is being distracted onto things that don't matter as much, right? It's the same thing that we're seeing within financial markets. We ask, how did the S&P 500 do today? Or how did the market do as compared to how did Apple Computer do? Or how did, Coca-Cola do, et cetera, right? People are much more focused on this idea of the aggregate, this idea that we have well-being as a nation as compared to, and that our stock markets are an indication of national strength as compared to some, disassociated indication of capital markets. And I don't entirely know why that's desirable. I think there's actually something that's really lost in that. And I forget what the Dunbar number is, what it's referred to, right? The number of relationships that you're able to maintain in a viable fashion. I think
it's 140, isn't it?
It's something like 140, 150, right? Imagine this. We have, representatives in Congress who now represent 600,000 people. I think it's actually more than that, right? That number is completely unmanageable, right? It really is. It's just, how can they possibly understand what my needs and wants are other than in the most abstract fashion? Whereas your local mayor, your local business council should actually have the opportunity to take these things into consideration and start to discuss, where do we want to go as a local community? We're not doing that.
So I have a few thoughts about that I want to share before I move into the second hour onto the premium feed, Mike. I think that this observation about local news, which, by the way, again, to kind of strengthen your point about Bill Maher, is something that he talked about in his last episode, speaks to the point about power and agency and the fact that That's the point. We become more of a population, less of a citizenry, where we have the capacity to act locally through institutions that we deem to be credible and which provide us with evidence of their credibility, and increasingly become swing voters in these populist death matches, which is, I feel like, where we're going, which is what's so scary, because that populist mechanism can actually lead to a quick and positive reset because it allows you to elect one very popular president and leader who can reform the system, but it can also, and often has, resulted in quite the opposite. So that's something to explore. Another thing I want to mention, or maybe this is the second thing I want to mention, has to do with your observation about tribalism. And you know how I feel about this. I mean, this is a huge, huge problem, because I mean, so much of what I do on this show and the value that I bring is that I curate. I identify who I want to bring on, and I structure. Now, this conversation today is not a great example of that. We've been somewhat unstructured. But normally when I do normal episodes, I try to create structure so that I can help lead my listeners through whatever it is that we're talking about. And I exercise a level of professionalism and self-censorship, not around information or relevant information, but rather around my opinion and about, again, trying to be professional with my role here, taking it seriously. And, another person that, we've talked about before, Barry Weiss, does this. And what's really interesting is that for a long time, the narrative about why we had such crappy news and such a shitty information ecosystem was because the funding model for journalism was broken. And so people couldn't actually, support these journalistic outfits. I don't think that's true anymore, actually, as evidenced by the flourishing of Substack and all these different subscription models. So at this point, I actually think there is a cultural, philosophical issue, which is that we need to, and this is, I think, just something that happens organically, and I hope it can happen. And I think those of us who believe in this model have a responsibility to do our best to continue to try and lead by example on it, which is that it's a choice. At the end of the day, you can choose to be more professional with how you engage with your audience and the seriousness with which you take your role as someone who has an audience and has the ability to influence what people believe or what people think. You could look at someone like Joe Rogan, actually, and see an evolution even in Joe Rogan's approach to this. He's become much more professional with who he has on. And when you think about how he's actually talked about this, there's a reason that he's never had Donald Trump on. Donald Trump's wanted to come on his show. He's actually refused to have Donald Trump on, not because Donald Trump's not newsworthy, not because Donald Trump isn't someone that I wouldn't jump at having on this show in a heartbeat. But the stated reason that Joe gave, and maybe this isn't 100% true, but if it were true, I think it's a valid one, is that he doesn't feel qualified to interview him, because if he were to have him on the show, Trump could run circles around him and create a misinformation maelstrom, which is, by the way, what a lot of the folks that he's had on his podcast have done in previous cases. And so that speaks to a kind of professionalism of saying, like, I have an enormous influence. Now, other people don't take this seriously at all. You have a guy like Alex Jones, who I chronicled in my most recent episode, who takes the exact opposite approach, which is that it's all an information war. I'm going to go out and say whatever I want. It doesn't matter. Those guys are lying, so I get to lie too. I get to say whatever I want. And so I really think this is the human corollary to the observations about the algorithms and the power of the platforms. But I think this is a huge thing. Those are just kind of two thoughts, Mike, but I have many more things that I want to talk to you about, assuming we have the time. Some of them are geopolitical, like China, Europe, inflation, the elections also, and some other things as well. But I'm going to move all of that onto the premium feed for the second hour of this conversation, Mike. For anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of today's conversation with Mike, as well as the episode transcripts and intelligence reports, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library, where you can also become a premium subscriber today. Mike, stick around. We're going to move the second hour of this conversation onto the premium feed.
Fantastic.
For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to full episodes, transcripts, and intelligence reports, which include additional notes, resources, links, and other material that will help you get the most out of each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website at hiddenforces.io. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.